Aaron Villarreal, you get extra credit. For pointing out that I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Okay. All right, we're back. What I was saying earlier was shout out to Enrique on the synths, okay? Gather round. The professor's lecture will begin shortly. I just need to set my shit up because a better man would have set his shit up already. But I am not a better man. How do I need that? Okay. All right, let's get this set up. And we'll begin the process, ladies and gentlemen. Let's capture a browser. Nope, that is not the browser. Let's capture window. Nice. Nice, Sue. We'll have our lecture notes here. That way people can follow along. Whoops. Let's center this here. Oh, yeah. We're in business, ladies and gentlemen. The link to the lecture notes should be in the description. If you'd like to follow along. Jesus fucking Christ. Sorry. Sorry about that. Now we'll have to do another window capture. Paul, why didn't you set this up beforehand? You had the entire day and you're unemployed. Shut the fuck up. Window capture 2. No, this one. Nope, wrong one. There we go. Nope, that's too big. Oh, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. And then we gotta fix this back to the fucking thing. All right. Okay, we don't need this. We don't need that. Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. Is the audio fine? Are we good here? Hello, hello, hello. Doo-doo-doo-doo. By the way, we're not watching this whole thing. We're watching the first part of it, not the entire 2-hour thing. Okay, that's good. Okay, now I got to open a new browser window. There we go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll figure this out and start here in about 2 minutes exactly. 2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. How's my audio? We're getting an echo or reverb. Hello, hello, testing 1, 2, 3. Is that true? How's my audio? We're getting an echo or reverb. Hello, hello, testing 1, 2, 3. Is that true? How's my audio? We're getting an echo or reverb. Hello, hello,
okay,
testing 1,
that's
2,
the
3.
echo.
Well, we'll have to deal with that momentarily. We'll go with desktop audio. Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. All right, is everyone ready? I hear the echo, but guess what? We're going to have to deal with it for momentarily, okay? We'll bring this nice up and snug. Glorious. All right, ladies and gentlemen. The lecture is about to begin. And if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. We're going to let Professor Jordan speak for the most part, but I'll throw in some commentary as we did last time. Let us, ladies and gentlemen, desktop audio, begin.
Well,
that's not the right fucking one.
You might as well start by...
There we go. Nobody's saying anything.
Now, I used this picture to represent my class. And you might not know anything about this picture. It's a picture of Jonah being thrown up out of a whale's belly after spending 3 days inside it. It's an old biblical story. It's a myth. It's a fairy tale. That's one way of looking at it. And I don't mean that in a derogative manner. We know, for example, that some of the Grimm's brothers' fairy tales are perhaps 15,000 years old. They've been traced way back. They're really, really old. And old stories are strange, and they're strange because, well, they've been told generation after generation after generation. And so you could imagine that something retold over such an expansive time has been reduced to its gist many, many times, and nothing that's in the story anymore is superfluous. It's all meaningful in some sense. It's sort of like a meta story. That's one way of thinking about it. Imagine that you took 100 books, 100 adventure books, and you had to extract out the central features of an adventure book. Now, it's hard to do that. It's like you're averaging across them or something like that, distilling them in some manner. Then you'd get a meta adventure, and it would be like a myth upon which all adventures are based. And this story is actually one of those stories. And I'm going to tell you what I think the story means. And I'm not saying that this is all it means, because most stories of this sort are in some sense inexhaustible, just like great works of art are inexhaustible. There's more information in them than you can possibly articulate. That's what makes them profound. That's why you go look at them, because otherwise someone could just tell you about the painting and that would be the end of that, but that doesn't work. So Jonah is being spit up by this whale, and of course on the face of it that's an impossibility, because, well, you can't live inside a whale. That's why it's impossible. Now you may remember, and likely do, that you all know a story about someone who is inside a whale. That's Pinocchio, right? And you go to that movie, maybe even as an adult, you watch that movie, and Geppetto's down there in the whale, in his little boat, it's big cavernous inside. You don't really care that there's a bunch of things you don't care about. You don't care that...
Real quick, how are we testing? Are we getting the audio? Is my audio a little too loud compared to his? I can't really turn him up anymore. This one's quiet. I think we should be good. I'll lower my audio just slightly so that
those are drawings and not real people. You don't care about that. And you don't care that the inside of a whale isn't a cavern. And you don't care that Pinocchio's a puppet, for that matter. None of that matters to you at all, and that's because you're really strange creatures, and you don't even notice when you're doing something absolutely absurd, and that's one of those times when you are. But if someone taps you on the shoulder and says, you're just watching drawings of a puppet. Puppets can't really move autonomously, and now he's at the bottom of the ocean. You have no idea why. He's going to rescue his father, and you're just sitting there and you're okay with that. And you'll say, shut up, because I want to finish watching the movie. And so that's interesting, you see. That tells you something about your unconscious, if you're psychoanalytically minded, because you're doing something that you cannot account for. Now you might say, well, it's enjoyable. Well, that's deep, man. You're really going a long ways with that. The question is, A, why is it comprehensible? B, why is it enjoyable? C, just exactly what are you doing there? And you think that whatever you are doing there is so valuable that you'll actually pay to do it.
Yeah, the entire concept of, if you're scientifically minded, unless you're an absolute nutso, right, absolute schizoid, you must understand that there is a rational explanation for why some movies are better than others, why some stories are of higher quality than others. Why is it that when Game of Thrones released its final episode, everyone universally hated it? There's something objectively bad about it. That's not a matter of taste or subjectivity, right? And if you rationally analyze it what you're doing is you're analyzing the structure of the story and the degree to which it gets grafted on the structure of our mind, right? There's a match. And those movies that are of the highest quality, those stories that are of the highest quality, convey things that activate the archetypal parts of our brain. And that's an objective phenomenon. It's not just, well, this movie is, better than the other and it's subjective. There's a subjective element to everything. In the same sense, it's like taste. Some people like certain food more than others, but steak people tend to converge on, and, rotten, infected flesh people tend to avoid. And there's so you can make objective claims about quality in art, which then reveals something about our psychology.
Weird. Very, very weird. And when you read about, let's say, the archaic rituals of tribal people, and you ask yourself, just what are they up to? You might think, well, they're up to the same thing that you're up to when you go see a movie. So, and then you might also notice that the most expensive artifacts, or among the most expensive artifacts that human beings create, are movies. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on them.
Dollars?
And we consider that a good deal. And it drives our technology too, because the high-tech movies, like the Marvel movies that require so much computer animation, they actually drive the demand for high-end graphics chips. So our technological advance forward is actually motivated in part by our desire to represent things fictionally in ever more spectacular manner. So, Jonah. Well, let me tell you the story of Jonah. And I'll tell you why I'm going to tell you it. This is from Camille Paglia, who's a critic of the modern university, and a very brilliant woman, I would say. Very controversial, incredibly rapid speaker, and she can think so fast, it's just unbelievable. She's really fun to watch, if you like that sort of thing. Vicious adversary in an argument. She says, the number one problem in academia today is not ignorant students, but ignorant professors, who have substituted narrow expertise and theoretical sophistication, a preposterous term for breadth and depth of learning in the world history of art and thought. Art is a vast, interconnected web work, a fabricated tradition, and over-concentration on any one point is a distortion. Here's a problem. I wrestled with this when I was trying to understand some of the things that I'm going to teach you about. There's some things that you kind of have to grasp as a whole. Sometimes you have a flash of insight and a bunch of things that you didn't know were related fall together. That's supposed to happen in psychotherapy when you link different disparate patterns of behavior together because you've linked them, say, with a single cause, and you get this like excited feeling of illumination and possibility. And there are forms of communication that require the simultaneous realization of a multitude of disparate phenomena. Like a movie can be like that. You listen to a movie, you watch a movie, and then you don't know what the hell's going on, and then something happens near the end, and bang, everything clicks together. And it's because you've sort of seen the thing as a whole. And a lot of the ways that we interact with the world that are mysterious are like that. And this is what Paglia is referring to, is that, and this is a psychoanalytic proposition, I would say, or a romantic proposition. The idea roughly is that way out in the periphery of reality are all those things that not only do you not know, but you don't even know you don't know, right? They're completely blind to their existence. And then there's unknown things that you have some suspicions about. And then there's unknown things that you can start to imagine and act out and dramatize. And so all of that is on the periphery of our knowledge. That's a psychoanalytic dictum. Where do thoughts come from? Well, partly they're nested in dreams. Dreams are the birthplace of thoughts. Fantasy, it's not that surprising. Fantasy is the birthplace of ideas. If you're thinking about what you're going to do in the future.
Yeah, and the question of where do thoughts come from, this is a central point he's going to hit on the entire time. But the idea is, in a dream, everything is very kind of, like dreamlike, and stuff is not, it doesn't seem linear and coherent as it does in waking life. And the idea is, before humans were developed, like prior to written language and prior to a rational, articulated worldview, waking life was the same as being in a dream. Like, imagine what it would be like to have no culture, or to have no language, and to have no scientific thought. Your conscious experience would be like that of being in a dream, in that things would be, spiritually active all the time and shit. And you'd be, you wouldn't be thinking logically. And consciousness evolved over a period of time with heightened levels of consciousness, where when you engage in rational thinking and the more you articulate things and the more you bring from the unconscious conscious, you become civilized, quote unquote, and have rational, coherent thinking. And so the idea that there's information on our periphery of our conscious brain, there's information that's deep in the unconscious that, that's vibes, right? That's what vibes-based analysis is. It's what intuition is. It's hitting on that latent amount of information that you can't articulate, right? Why was the way that comedian told that joke particularly funny? Like what exactly about his delivery was funny? Just the way he said it was funny. It's like, that, but you can't articulate it. And that's that peripheral stuff. And our intuitions catch that before we're able to articulate it in thought. Hence, vibes being better than logic. Pavel, thank you. Thank you, Pavel. Godspeed. Let's continue.
You enter into a reverie, a dream state, and you contemplate multiple possibilities, and then you start thinking them through. Use your imagination to search beyond where you are. And the collective human attempt to do that is our mysterious, humanistic, artistic tradition, which is very difficult to justify from a formal, articulate point of view. What good is dance? Like, what is it that you're doing when you're dancing? Well, you don't care because you like to dance. Why? Well, you don't know, but you do. It's built into you. Music. Music's a human universal. Cultures use music to organize themselves, right? They use music to catalyze their identities. They use music to unite around. In more archaic societies, less differentiated societies, let's say, a mask that represents part of the family tradition will have a particular design, and there'll be a particular song written for it, and there'll be a particular dance about it. And the song and the dance are something like the symbolic representation of a mode of being in the world. Like maybe the mask is a wolf mask, and so you act out the wolf, and there's music that goes along with that. And you think, well, what are you doing when you're acting out the wolf? And part of that is, well, you're trying to understand wolves. It's imitation in part, and if you live in the natural world, and if you hunt, and if you're preyed upon, then understanding the things that you're hunting and preying upon is useful, and there's also perhaps useful things to learn from them. And so we play this strange symbolic game with the world, like children pretending. That's another way of thinking about it. And we do that to act out and to begin to understand things we don't understand, like how to act. Now for me, the most important question in life is not what the world is made of. And in fact, I would say that's a relatively new preoccupation of humankind. We didn't really formalize, you could say that the ancient Greeks laid the groundwork for the emergence of an empirical science. And then it emerged more formally with Bacon and Descartes and Newton 500-600 years ago, not very long, like a blink of the eye in human terms. Before that, people were engineers, they could build things and so forth, but they didn't know they weren't scientists. They didn't really conceptualize the world as an objective place. We do that automatically because science has seeped so far into our set of presuppositions. That doesn't make us good scientists, by the way, but it does make us believe that the fundamental reality of the world is an objective reality. And I'm not going to dispute that particularly, but leaves one set of questions unanswered, probably by its nature, because it wasn't designed to answer the question, and that question is, how should one conduct oneself in the world?
Yeah, so this point, this is, if you're going to understand Petersonian philosophy, like what's the first possible thing? Maps of meaning, Petersonian, whatever you want to call it. The number one claim, first thing, is there are two realities, quote unquote, or there are two ways to view reality. There's reality as a place of things and material objects, which is, what most people, that's how we think of things. Science, what is it made of? Who are, consciousness is just a function of brain, chemical reactions and all that. World as a place of things and objects and material, and then a world as a form for action, a world as what to do in the world. It's the same is and ought with David Hume. You can't derive an is from an ought. There's the world of what is the world made of, and then how should we act in it. And the central idea is you cannot derive how you should act. You cannot derive what you should value solely based on the material facts out in the world. You come into the world looking at this set of material facts with some pre-wired conceptions, right? And it's sort of like, well, what's the number one most important thing in Christianity? It's like God is real and Jesus is his son. Okay, the number one important thing in maps of meaning is there's the world of material and the world of values, right? There's the world of logic and the world of vibes. That's not a great dichotomy, but it maps onto it slightly.
And that's an important thing, since you're alive, and hypothetically you'd rather stay alive, and while you're alive you probably don't want to suffer any more than you have to, and no more stupidly than you have to, and it might also be good if some of the things that you wanted actually happened, and so you're motivated to know how to act. And people are always telling each other how to act. We're sending each other information all the time about how to act. We do that with the expressions on our face, and of course when we talk to people we always look at their face, and that's because their face tells you what they're up to. If they're smiling and paying attention to you, well then you can assume that you're doing something right. And if they're looking annoyed or disgusted, that's a particularly bad one, then you might take a hint from that, especially if 3 or 4 people are doing it at the same time. And so we're reflecting some ideal to one another constantly. And the more attentive you are, the more likely you are to act in accordance with that ideal, and the more likely you are to move towards it. You may not even know what the ideal is in an articulated sense. In fact, you probably don't. You could come up with a good person is nice and friendly and cooperative, and that's all just cliche. But you don't, your conception might be very hollow. It's very likely that it's very hollow, even though you may be able to act in a very sophisticated manner. All right, so anyways, this is a story. I'd say it's a meta story. It's what would happen if you collected a bunch of stories and then you extracted out a story from them. And it's sort of a story about destiny, and it's couched in a religious language, but that's okay, because most of these distilled stories,
that would be Destiny the Fate, not the left-wing streamer, as some of you may be familiar with.
Stories form the foundation of religious texts, and myths and stories are, as I said, part of the outer perimeter of our society. They have a coherent nature, and they form a foundation. And it's on that foundation that everything that you take for granted rests, even if you don't understand the foundation. So I can give you an example. There's a metaphysical idea that underlies Western civilization, and that metaphysical idea is that the individual has transcendent worth.
Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Everyone watching, hopefully, presumably, takes that for granted because it was beaten into you as a child. But that's the world of the, well, we'll start with these axioms. We're not going to, well, what's the rational explanation for why everyone is created equal? It's like, well, because God did it. It's like, okay, well, now you're positing the existence of God in order to justify your rational explanation for why everyone's created equal. So all of these assumptions that you don't even realize until you go somewhere where they don't believe that, right? Where like slavery is justified or something like that. That is the implicit, metaphorical substrate is what, one way to term it. All of the implicit claims and beliefs and propositions, not propositions. I guess it would be propositions that you could put in propositional form, but all of the things you take for granted that you don't even realize you take for granted. Democracy is good. Well, why? Because you learned that in school when you were young. And there's a real, that still makes it real, like memes evolved in order to be beaten into us as children, right? We learn language as children. So the human being evolved to learn language when we were children. So there are ideas that we're supposed to learn as children that, evolution has selected for, but we'll get into that later.
That's the idea from which the notion of natural rights is derived. And of course, our legal system is predicated on the idea that you have certain natural rights. They're enshrined in the Bill of Rights, for example. And in the States, when the Bill of Rights was being formulated, when the original legislation that founded the state was being formulated, the formulators said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? They're axioms of faith, right? They're propositions, and there's no proof for them. They're a mode of operation in the world. And so the hypothesis is something like, well, if I treat you like there's something about you that has transcendent value, implicit, intrinsic value, whatever that might be, and there are stories about that and we'll talk about that, and you do the same to me, and then we set up a body of laws that recognizes the sovereignty of the individual, so that the law itself has to act with respect towards every individual, even if that individual has done something reprehensible, which is very weird if you think about it, then our society will work better. And, well, perhaps that's true, but for better or worse, that is what this society is predicated on, and that's a very, 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 very old idea. And it's an idea that people came to with great difficulty, because it was over thousands of years that people learned how to take their little tribal groups, which were always squabbling with one another, right, because they're human beings, they're very violent, and tribal groups are by no means civilized. There's no noble savage like the Europeans thought. If you study tribal groups in the world today, the death rate by violence is unbelievably high. So something unites a tribe within a tribe, it's often kinship, but then tribes come together to form larger civilizations, and they have to determine some sort of meta principle that guides them so that they can cooperate and come together without destroying one another, and they have to extract out a principle by which the society might function, and that has to work. And then as societies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they have to bring more and more of these diverse traditions together and extract out something from them that has power and functional utility and that allows people to unite. And so this is one of the stories that talks about that. It's a story about individual responsibility and what happens when it's not heeded. So, you know, because we could say, you are a social creature, right to the core, and most of your environment is other people, and those other people want something from you, and you want something from them, so you're going to play games with them.
Real quick, this is an important nuance. When he says your environment is other people, what you have to realize that means is that in the same way that, okay, we think about like an animal is adapted to its environment, right? So a bird has the same color feathers as the leaves that it camouflages itself in. So we think animals are adapted to their environment, and the environment is a physical reality. Human beings evolved, you have to think of other people as part of the environment. So in the same way that I might, you know, my skin might be lighter because my ancestors evolved in areas where there was, you know, less sun, you also have to think, okay, human beings evolved to the existence of other human beings as part of that environment. And so in this, like literally in this, to the same degree that every, you know, cell in your body is evolved to a physical environment, every structure of your mind is evolved to the social environment as well. And so there's literally a social reality and a physical reality, and they both are bearing on you at any given time. I experience this personally when, if I'm ever like high and having a panic attack, one sec. Is that my... That's my ice maker. If I'm high and having a panic attack, you know, I get super existential. Oh my God, physical reality. What even is it? I'm derealizing, I'm depersonalizing. What, you know, are these things even real? But then you'll notice if you're ever having one of those like inner thought moments, if you suddenly have to deal with a problem in front of you, like people, you suddenly snap out of it. The most real thing is now the person looking at you and your interaction with them, right? You'll next time you're ever like nervous for something like, you know, an interview or a date or something that's very interpersonal, try and rationalize yourself into having an existential like, well, what is reality? Is reality real? And what is physical reality? It's like, oh no, the social reality is the real thing, and because that's what your mind focuses on, right? It views it as, you know, in the case of like a high stakes interview, you're viewing that as like a predator, like, so your body is wired to look at that no matter what. You don't get to use your existential rationalization. Oh, well, logically, we're all just specks of dust. It's like, that only works when you're completely outside of the environment that we were adapted to, which is other people in being engaged with the world. Anyway.
You're either going to be good at it or you're going to be bad at it, but you're going to play games with them. And so the game might have rules, really sophisticated rules, in fact. And you'd expect that because as your behavior...
Bob Wilkinson, self-evident implies a degree of social coherence and similarity of social environment that our celebration of uniqueness is destroying. True. That is a good point. As a public school teaching, the number one fundamental issue is the lack of self-evident truths being taught to children. They are instead learning them subconsciously from entertainment media. Yeah, well, this is the issue with should Christianity be taught in schools? It's like, well, religion can't be taught in schools, but we'll teach wokeness, which is, of course, has just as many axiomatic claims as religion, right? Wokeness, right? Everyone is equal and racism is bad. It's like, okay, I agree with that. Well, I agree with the racism is bad and everyone is equal in a divine sense, but like, you know, you should act like Christ. Well, that is the implicit message of Western civilization, but you just can't make it explicit.
more and more approximates an ideal, assuming such a thing exists, then you're more and more sophisticated, and the nature of the ideal is perhaps more and more complex and difficult to understand. You get a hint of this, though. You can get a hint of this because you will see, if you pay attention to your own soul, your psyche, your unconscious, you'll see that there are people that you admire and that there are people that you have contempt for. And it isn't necessarily that you're 100% accurate in your judgment. You know, it's not such a bad idea to criticize your first impressions. But those states exist, and so there's a reason you admire someone, and there's a reason you have contempt for someone. There may be multiple reasons, and that's a hint to your intrinsic value structure. It's a hint about your intrinsic value structure, right? You wouldn't admire someone unless there was something about them that you valued, and perhaps that you would also like to be able to do. And you wouldn't despise someone or have contempt for them if you didn't feel that something they were doing was wrong, and that it would be wrong if you did it too. And so you're bringing to bear on the situation an implicit morality, and you have to do that because, as I said, you can't act without a morality, because if you're going to act, you're going to try to make things better. Otherwise, why bother? And if you're acting to make things better, then some things have to be better and some things have to be worse, and that's a value structure. Yeah,
this is like a fundamental axiom here. There is literally, by definition, there's nothing that you can physically do. You cannot act. There's no such thing as action absent a value structure. No such thing as act. I mean, you like a robot that you wind up and send off. That's not acting. That's just, you know, it doesn't have any agency. But if you're an agent, a conscious agent, every single down to the movement of your fingers, if there's any conscious action taken, it is because you're trying to achieve some goal, explicit or implicit. Right? Like your heart beating is not an action. It's a thing it's just a thing that's happening. But anytime you do something, that's an action. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily conscious. Like if you see it's like when a jump scare, if you see like a snake, or you're walking and you see a snake right by your foot, you go, oh shit. You do that action. The implicit goal of that action is survive, but you don't think that through. And so that's what it means to have an implicit goal or an explicit goal, right? If I want to watch the rest of this video, I'm going to click on the play button. That's a conscious goal. But if a snake appears right here and I go, oh shit, well, I'm still achieving a goal. The goal is just implicit, and I act without it. So there's all kinds of nuances in the language that you got to think about. That is different, you know, like goal. Well, it doesn't just mean like I'm setting a goal for myself, like, you know, in some self-help thing. It's like, no, goal means explicit or implicit state that you're trying to achieve, unconsciously or consciously.
So you have one. All right, so Jonah.
But if you teach Christianity, people of other faiths feel pressured or left out. Maybe that's okay. If Christianity is the faith that allows other faiths to be in that country, then it's okay to elevate Christianity because it doesn't exclude the other faiths. Now, okay, that's super vague, and it depends on what strand of Christianity we're talking about. But Western civilization is for sure founded on the idea that all are created equal before God, which would be, for example, the opposite in the Hindu caste system, right? The Hindu caste system is a bad idea. It's a worse culture because it starts from the axiom people are simply by virtue of birth born into different statuses, which is antithetical to Western civilization. And it's only antithetical to secularism because secularism comes out of Christianity.
Gets a call from God, and God tells him that there's a city, Nineveh, that's falling into moral disarray. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a universal story. It's like all cultures are always falling into disarray. It's their nature. Just entropy does that, right? Things change, the world changes, the environment changes, and the culture doesn't keep up very well, and then of course it has corrupt elements, and so it's an eternal story. The individual is always placed in relationship to a culture that's somewhat corrupt. And then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And if the answer is nothing, well then it'll just get more corrupt. And if the answer is be corrupt too, then it will just get more corrupt. So the answer has to be to oppose the corruption, because that's the only way it's going to stop. Now, God threatens to destroy this city because of its corruption, and I don't think you need to presume anything particularly metaphysical about that to understand it. It's very straightforward that the more corrupt a culture is and the less trust is possible between individuals, the less productive the culture is going to be, because why do anything if some corrupt person is just going to come and take it? You know, it might even be that the culture is so corrupt that if you are good for something and you produce resources, you're actually more likely to get killed because you have something of value. So like you're just not going anywhere with that. And why would you work if you didn't have any sense that, you know, you could store up the value of your work for some reasonable time in the future? So if the society is corrupt and there's no trust, it's degenerating. And you know, it might live for a while, but it isn't going to last very long, and so that's the idea. Corrupt societies collapse.
Hot take.
That leaves open what corrupt.
Well, to be fair, you hear that in all of the I'm not having kids because the world is going to end, so why would you have kids? It's like, that's a sign of a degenerate, corrupt culture if that's the attitude. And so that, you know, the idea is you can look at any given story and you'll see the universal pattern, the universal story within it. And Jonah and Nineveh is that.
Corruption means. Anyways, Jonah thinks, no, no bloody way. I'm not going to that city. They can go to hell as far as I'm concerned, and that's really what he thinks. And why in the world should I do anything about it anyways? And these are good objections. It's like, why would you do that? And you'll face this, believe me, in your life. You will face this. In fact, you already do, always, constantly, continually, in small ways perhaps, when you're interacting with people who aren't treating you properly. And when you're acting, and those might be your parents, they might be your friends, they might be people at your workplace, they might be professors. They're playing a crooked game, and you don't like it. And you know it's crooked. And so then the question is, well, what should you do about it? Well, if you know it's crooked, it's not so good to play along with it. I mean, we'll say that you know it's crooked by your own standard of values. It degrades you to play along with it. You're going to stand up and oppose it? Well, no, probably not. You're probably going to do what Jonah did, jump on a ship and get the hell out of there. And, you know, that's a logical thing to do, but it doesn't solve the problem. And I think this has something to do with human ethical responsibility, because there are other old stories, and I'll tell you one likely, where the son of the king, the Lion King, the son of the king, he goes off and he's some pathetic adolescent, and then he's shamed by the reappearance of his old girlfriend into turning into something vaguely useful, and he opens his eyes and he goes back and he fights Scar, and you know, it's a scene of hell, right, because there's fire everywhere, and he fights Scar, finds out Scar killed his father. He casts him into the pit, roughly speaking, and then the rain comes. And then, you know, the movie returns to its beginning, fundamentally. It's paradise, paradise lost, paradise regained. That's the movie. And I mean, that's the story of...
Real quick, that idea, for those of you who've seen my archetypal memetics video, the normal distribution, the archetypal meme curve, paradise loss, paradise lost, paradise regained. That's the midwit meme. Dumb idea. Midwit comes in and attacks this dumb idea thinking he's correct. The smartest person realizes that the dumb idea was correct all along, but has a better articulation of it. Paradise, paradise lost, paradise regained. Low IQ, correct take, doesn't know why. middling IQ, incorrect take, but sounds like it could be correct, super high IQ, comes back to the low IQ take, but with a better articulation of it.
Human beings, you know.
That's why that meme is meaningful.
In a place that's working out pretty well, something happens to knock you off your perch, you're down in the chaos for a good amount of time, and maybe you never get out. But maybe you learn something down there, maybe you strengthen your character, then you pop up to a new place, and maybe it's better. Better aim, better you. Now, I'm not being overly optimistic about this. I know perfectly well that people encounter impediments during their life that they find almost impossible to recover from. But it's the best shot you have. So anyways, Jonah runs away, but God isn't very happy about that because it's actually Jonah's destiny. It's necessary for Jonah to repair the city. So God sends a storm, and you know, the waves are high, and I think what that means is because the water is often a symbol for the unconscious, and that's because things lurk down there in the water and that you can pull up that are useful. Monstrous things that you can pull up that are useful. You can fish for them. You can go fishing in your own being for answers, which is what you do when you try to think, right? You ask yourself a question and you wait, and maybe an answer appears. It's like, where did that come from? You didn't know what the answer was before it appeared. Would it just pop into being out of nowhere? Who knows? So you fish. So anyways, the waves come and the boat's going to be knocked over, and that's what happens, I think, when you know you should do something. I mean, everyone has this experience, I believe. Perhaps you would be willing to put up your hands if this experience is foreign to you, okay? There's part of you telling you you should do something, and it's hard to do it, effortful, and maybe you're afraid of it, and so you don't do it, you just procrastinate, right? And so how do you feel about that? Good? I mean, so what, you feel that you're betraying yourself. Your anxiety actually gets worse, not better, even though you can put it off moment to moment, but that doesn't help because every time you put it off, the anxiety just grows a little bit. You're not proud of yourself. You have a sense that you're making things more chaotic than they should be. And if you do that long enough, and I'm sure many of you have had that experience, if you do that long enough, if that becomes habitual, things will get so stormy around you that you'll fall right into the chaos, into the watery chaos, and maybe you'll drown. So it's not a very good idea to run from your destiny, let's say. Whatever that might be.
Again, and this is where I can understand someone saying, okay, wait a minute. So Jonah being called by God to go to Nineveh, you're saying that that's like an abstraction of the idea that if I have homework to do and I'm putting it off, it's like I'm creating anxiety for myself. I mean, the idea is the reason that you can understand the reason. The same part of your brain that understands, putting my homework off creates anxiety. It's something I have to do, and I'm not doing it, and I know it'll hurt me. It's like that idea first bore out in a story like Jonah and the whale. And like the word anxiety, it's like, well, they didn't have the word anxiety back then. So like, what do you call that which comes from within you and punishes you for your own failings that you failed on? Well, we didn't have the word anxiety. We didn't have the word unconscious until Freud. So of course these ideas are going to be, sound abstract. It's like the Tower of Babel, kind of weird. Like it's not that significant. Like why not the, I don't know, the cosmic mountain or something. It's like because a tower that if you've ever stood under like a fucking, Sears Tower or Empire State Building and you look up, that's awe-inspiring. So like when the Tower of Babel, it's like you have to put yourself in the shoes of the people that read it. Like a tower that tall is like a psychologically powerful thing. It's as significant as, whatever modern equipment. What's the Star Wars equivalent? Some Death Star space station. Because that makes sense because it matches our cultural context. But these ideas first developed in their proto form. Right, the structure, and then the things we understand just fit into that underlying structure that evolved over millions of years. It's complicated.
And you need a destiny, you need a place to aim at because that's what gives your life meaning. And you need meaning in your life because life is hard. So, you need something to buttress yourself against that. So anyways, they wake Jonah up and Jonah says, that's probably my fault because like I'm running away from something I'm supposed to do and God isn't very happy about that, so why don't you just throw me overboard? And the crew isn't very happy about that, but the waves are really starting to come up and Jonah's pretty insistent that he's the cause of the problem And so they draw lots, and Jonah is chosen, and so they decide to toss him into the ocean, and immediately everything's calm. So he's a center of chaos because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Fine. Well, then a whale comes up and swallows him, and then he's in the whale for 3 days. Now, that's a weird thing. The whale, that's the whale that Geppetto's in. That's a dragon. It's that thing that you have to go out there and conquer to get something of value. Now, when you've made an error, when you've fallen off the pathway, when you've deviated from what you know you should do, it produces a state of internal chaos and worry and concern. You're thrust into the unknown. You're thrust into unknown territory and chaos. You don't know what to do. And that's often symbolized by the encounter with a monster, like a dragon, or something that lives under the water. And I think the reason for that is, as far as I've been able to tell, is that human beings, because we've been prey animals for forever, in our battle with carnivorous lizards, for example, and alligators, and even dinosaurs, because there were dinosaurs around at the time of our most distant ancestors. And there was even a cat at one point that was adapted with teeth to pierce human skulls. So it had a head that was exactly shaped to grab you here and put a tooth through the back of your skull. So like, we've come through some rough times, man, and we have a system in our mind that's a threat predator detection system. That's the thing that makes little kids think about monsters in the dark.
Okay, I'm going to just go back here. This is very important.
Threat predator detect, man, and we have a system in our mind that's a threat predator detection system. That's the thing that makes little kids think about monsters in the dark, right? Because, well, there is monsters in the dark. Parents always say, well, there's no monsters in the dark. It's like, that's not true. The dark is full of monsters. There might not be any in your room right at that moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't monsters in the dark. And crimes take place, like, criminals don't get up at 6 in the morning and, like, you know, have breakfast and go rob a bank. They do that sort of thing at night. People do the things that are fit for the night in the night. And lots of predators are nocturnal, and you can't see very well in the dark. And kids aren't stupid, you know. They've evolved to stay pretty damn close to the fire, because the kids that wandered away from the fire got picked off by hyenas and lions and, you know, crocodiles and whatever else the hell was out there to eat the unwary. So the circuit that we use to defend ourselves against predators, as we've evolved cortically, that circuit has come to represent what we don't know in general. Because the predators, of course, inhabit where we don't know. And so evolution is a conservative force, and we use the circuits that we've evolved to represent new things. And so the unknown, the chaos, is often represented by a monster that swallows you up and pulls you down. And you know, when you're feeling terrible, you don't say, well, I'm feeling up. You say, I'm feeling down. Well, why is that? Well, down is worse. I guess you're flat on the ground when you're down, or you're in a hole or something like that. You're hiding in a hole. You know, it's down.
Okay, a couple things. First off, what he just said, when you're up, or when you're feeling bad, or excuse me, when you're feeling good, you say you're feeling up, or when you're feeling bad, you say you're feeling down. Someone could immediately say, and a good objection would be, I could very easily imagine another language where it's switched. You know, in whatever Swahili they say down, and this is Peterson over-reading into things to say, oh well, I'm feeling up, you know, and up is towards the clouds, and that's why heaven is thing, and that's why like heaven is in the clouds. Okay, wrong. This is metaphorical cognition. George Lakoff, this is another person whose lectures we should watch. There are certain metaphors that are universal, that all languages converge on. So, like for example, up is more and down is less. There is no language. So for example, if you say prices are going up or temperatures are going up, well, prices and temperatures, what do you mean up? Those are not physical things, right? Up equals more and down equals less is a universal metaphor that you find in all languages, right? Time equals money. I saved time. I spent time. I invested my time in this. I don't have time for that. That's a unique metaphor that's culturally determined. There are cultures that don't have that metaphor for time equals money, and so their conception of time is different. Same with spatial. Left and right, I believe this is the case. There are some cultures that don't have words for left or right. They use cardinality, north, south, east, west. And literally, depending on what language you adopt, those people that have the language that is north, south, east, west, they're better at like identifying their location when they're lost. I don't know the exact studies. You'd have to look into it. And so this is important, right? Like there's certain metaphors that are built into us to that show up in our language and that are universal. There's other interesting ones, like when we say someone is a warm person, there's many different languages that we say, oh, this person is warm, warm-hearted, warm-spirited. There's other languages that are something similar, because warm, when you're a baby and you're pressed against your mother, you feel warmth. It's warmth equals, goodness. So we say that person's warm-hearted, except in cultures that are in very hot areas where, when you're a baby, you don't need to be heated up. You need to be cooled down. And so their metaphors, those are the places where the metaphors don't hold. And so you look at this landscape of metaphors and like how language is structured, and it's like, damn, the metaphors we use are very physical, physical dependent. And that's the kind of thing of up equals more, I'm feeling up, not feeling, I'm feeling up equals feeling good. And so, just on that point, and then the social threats here. Your brain reappropriates circuits for different threats. The same part of your brain that activates when you see a snake, literally, is the exact same part of your brain that if you are at your desk and an email comes in, it says something, you're fired. Right? Or if someone sends you a text and says like, I have your passwords, you owe me $10,000, something like that. It's like your heart drops. You view that as a threat. It's like, what the fuck? Now it's not the same scale, because a snake is immediate, like get the fuck out. But there's certain how can you view an envelope? The example he uses, or an email. How can you view a thing on your screen with the same, as a horrible thing, like if it says you get fired and lose your job and then you can't support your family? How can an email do that to you? It's because it's hitting on the same part of your brain, the same neural circuits that are used when you see a fucking predator, right? Because it is a predator. Oh, fuck. Right? And so the category of predator has been expanded to, emails that say you get fired. Oh, well, that's a bit of a stretch. It's like, not really. Arguably, that's the neuroscientific foundation.
You're threatened by something, maybe you're threatened by your own inadequacy. That might be part of it. Maybe that's partly what you imagine as a monstrous force, because your proclivity towards procrastination and your weakness of character is part and parcel of why you happen to be in the underworld. And that's the underworld, the mythological underworld. That's where you go when things fall apart. And if you understand that, if you know that that's what that means, then you have one of the keys that opens up ancient stories to you, and you understand things. Your life can be organized, going very well, and then something comes up, and poof, everything changes. Some axiom that you were living by, and it might be the existence of a partner, it might be a job, it might be your health, any of those things, gone. And you go somewhere when that happens. You go somewhere. It's a state of being. You're still in the same world, but it's not the same at all anymore. Everything about it is different. It's all negative and dark, and you don't know what to do. You're confused. And so, what do you do down there in the underworld when things have fallen apart, especially if it's the worst possible case scenario and you realize that you actually had something to do with your demise? That's really annoying, when something...
Real quick, I wonder if the language you learned during your formative years primes the brain for certain personality traits, behaviors, or beliefs. It absolutely does. Again, going back to the cardinality, some cultures don't have or languages for left and right. It's north, south, east, west. Or a better example is, I think in Russian, there's like 100 different words for different shades of blue. But in English, we only have a few. And the Russians are better at identifying, like literally looking at the color spectrum, they can identify when two shades are the same or different, because they have these different words. Their language literally predisposes them to see color differences better than someone who doesn't have that language, right? You know, even just, again, like the word unconscious. Like, imagine if you didn't have the concept of the word unconscious. There's so many things that you can then start to see once you have the concept of unconscious, right? Like, oh, you know, he's, well, whatever, I can't think of some example. But you get my point. Words prime you to see the world differently.
Something bad happens to you, and then, you know, you grind yourself into bits trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then you realize that, well, you were playing a causal role. Now, sometimes you're so depressed you assume you're playing a causal role, and you weren't. It's not easy to figure out by any stretch of the imagination, and it isn't that everyone who does something terrible is at fault for it, but sometimes you find that you were off the path somehow, and maybe even that you knew it and you didn't attend to it, and that's why all of this hit the fan. And so then down there in that chaos, you decide that you're going to do what you're supposed to do.
Graydon, this is called the Sapir word hypothesis, and it's debunked. Interesting. I'll have to look this up.
Instead. And then maybe you get to rise up.
Language is not informed perception. Well, that's, well, it depends on what you mean by that, but that sounds completely wrong to me. But who knows? I'm merely explaining what this quack scientist has to say.
Up again, renewed, if you're lucky, and then you can go fix the city. And that's what this story's about. And that's why I picked the image to represent the course, because really what happens, you see, with the psychoanalysts, the road to health, if you're not doing well, which means that as you act in the world, you're not getting what you want. There's something wrong with the match between your presuppositions and your actions, habitual, and the way the world is responding to you. And so it's not turning out for you. And the question is, well, what can you do about that? And one answer might be to examine yourself for presuppositions and action patterns that are not serving you well, and to find out what they are and what to do about them. And maybe some of that is, maybe you're not moving forward because of fear, and maybe that fear is grounded in terrible experiences that you had in the past that you've never been able to understand. And maybe one of the ways of gluing yourself back together and expanding your personality so that you could in fact live properly in the world is to go back to those terrible events and untie them and straighten them out and understand them and drop them. And that's what psychotherapy is about in large part. Psychoanalytic, behavioral, doesn't matter. What are you afraid of? What are you avoiding? What are you failing to develop? Maybe from fear, maybe from avoidance, God only knows, maybe from disgust. How can you get over it? How can you reclaim those parts of yourself? I said in the first lecture that I was going to try to provide you with a schema into which you could place the theorists that we're going to discuss, and it requires going down deep to do that. And there are presuppositions. My presupposition, and this is a psychoanalytic presupposition, it's predicated on a poetic tradition, I would say, on an ancient tradition. I learned most of it from reading Jung. It was Carl Jung that helped me understand that we're nested inside a dream, that we have to be, because we don't know everything. We have to take things as givens, and the things that we take as givens are nested inside stories, and we accept the stories as valid, and then outside the stories is the absolute unknown. You know, and that's partly, the stories are tricky, you know. One of the classic stories, it's a variant of the Jonah story, I would say, is St. George and the Dragon. And that story was represented during the Renaissance and during medieval times thousands and thousands of ways. It's like the story of St. Patrick who chased the snakes out of Ireland, same idea. And the typical St. George story is The Hobbit or Harry Potter. So in the second volume of Harry Potter, correct me if I have any of these details wrong, you remember there's that snake, the basilisk? So there's this magic castle, right? You guys have no problem with that. Magic castle, no problem. There's an orphan, he's an orphan, he goes to the magic castle to learn how to be more than normal, right? The muggles, he has a muggle family. We're not too happy with the muggle family. Like, as representatives of normal people, they have some lacks. Now of course the reason for that is that, well, that's what teenagers often feel about their parents, right? They feel, Jesus, these couldn't really be my parents. I must have some other parents who are like together. And those are like magical parents, right? Parents that live in the sky. And of course Harry Potter has earthly parents, that's the muggles. And Dursley, I think, is the kid. He's a wonderful piece of work. And you know, ill-formed, eh? spoiled, ill-formed, selfish, very far from the ideal. He's a foil for Harry. And of course he's appreciated and doted on, and Harry is actually punished for his virtues. Well, that's a classic story, right? To be punished for your virtues. I mean, if you look at the story, the central story in Christianity, the central story in Christianity is about someone who is precisely punished in the worst possible way for the highest possible virtues. And that's what it makes it an archetypal story, because there isn't anything more unfair than that. And so it's a limit in a sense. It can't be worse than that. Being punished for being, unworthy, it's like, yeah.
On that point, this is a point Peterson brings up often, is the biblical stories are the most archetypal because you can't dream up anything more, what do you call it? Unfair or tragic than that. Sam Harris one time said he disputed that that's necessarily the worst story. Like he could come up with something conceptually, but I never heard anything that did push that further. And I find that interesting. I'd be curious because it does make sense. Perfect person, betrayed by his own people, killed in front of a mob, tortured. Like that's, the least deserving person got the worst deserving punishment. Betrayed, social embarrassment, all that. All of the archetypal elements that would make a story worse are there. But Sam Harris said, well, maybe you could come up with a worse one. And I'd be curious. Maybe you can.
Yeah, well, at least makes...
And then you say, well, but then who ultimately determines, well, isn't it just a subjective opinion as to which one's worse? No, in the same sense that, well, isn't it just subjective as to which Game of Thrones episodes are better than others? It's like, no. Again, I use it as, for people who haven't seen it, Game of Thrones was the best show on television, universally loved by everyone who watched it, who watched it regularly. But then it was the last episodes were universally hated. And so how do you explain that unless there's something objective about the story that clashed with the way that our minds perceive stories? Right? Because it's like, well, everyone was primed to love no one wanted to hate the episode or the last season. No one wants to hate a show that they love so much and spend all this time to. But there's something objective about the story that hit out, and you can say, well, some people said it was bad and then it spread, it's like a social contagion. That's just bullshit. Nobody who's watched the end of Game of Thrones would believe that. It's very clearly bad in and of itself. But anyway.
Sense, but to be punished because you have your act together and you're a good person, that's real punishment. And that's what happens to Harry. So luckily he finds out that he's magical, which is quite convenient, and off he goes to wizarding school. And that's actually like going and studying the humanities. I mean, it was when they still were, because it's through the humanities that you make contact with the magic of your culture. And that makes you more than merely the child of your parents. Because you are more than merely the child of your parents. You're the child of nature and you're the child of culture. And until you understand what that means, understand that you have two sets of parents, like the divine hero always has two sets of parents, you can't construe yourself properly as an individual. You're not situated properly in the world.
First off, Kiwi, intersubjective is different from objective. That's a great point. Objective and subjective are insufficient terms. Right? This is like a fundamental problem with, again, the way is it objective or subjective? Intersubjective is kind of like objective. Is it objectively true that, well, this is not a green screen, but if this was a green screen, if I say, is it objectively true that that's green? Yeah, if you're colorblind, then no. So, yes, intersubjective is different from objective as it's out in the world, but it gets very complicated. But that's a good point.
You don't know what your responsibilities are. You can't orient your...
We need new terms like transjective or superjective. Oh, Henry Hanks. A+, Golden Star student of the day, transjective, John Vervaeke. Brilliant term.
Your values properly, and you will suffer for that. Because, as far as I can tell, because life is so difficult, you have to do something that's truly worthwhile in order to justify it. And so, well, and that's what all these stories tell you. That's what the story of Jonah is telling you. It's like you have an ethical duty to straighten things up. And if you don't do it, you're going to be sorry. And that story is echoed everywhere. Well, now St. George, well, let's go to Harry Potter. That's what we were talking about. So he goes off to the magic castle, and he's learning to be a wizard. And he's kind of an interesting character, right? Because he's not really good. And we find out, I think that's because, doesn't he have a piece of Voldemort in him. Isn't that what happens? Yeah. And that's what that means, is that to be good, truly good, you can't just follow rules. That's very clear in the Harry Potter story. And you also have to be able to understand malevolence. And in order to understand malevolence so that you can withstand it, you have to understand that part of you that's malevolent. Because if you don't, you're naive. And if you're naive, you're easy pickings. And so that's a Jungian idea too. And the Jungian idea is that part of personality development is to understand your shadow. And the shadow is those things about you that you do not want to admit to. And you can learn about your shadow by reading history. You know, you can read about Auschwitz. You can read about the concentration camps in Russia. And you can imagine yourself as a guard instead of as a heroic rescuer of unfortunate victims, which would be very, very unlikely. And once you can imagine yourself as a guard, which is a terrifying thing to do, then you understand something about yourself. And I actually think, and I think this is also from studying Jung, that you cannot have proper respect for yourself until you know that you're a monster, because you won't act carefully enough. You know, if you think, well, I'm a nice person, I'd never do anyone any harm, it's like, you're no saint. You can be sure of that. And the harm that you do people can come in many, many ways. And so, if you regard yourself as harmless, inoffensive, nice, well, why do you have any reason to be careful? You're like a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. Even if you throw it at someone, no one's going to get hurt. But that isn't what you're like, because you're a human being, and human beings are some vicious creatures. And there's utility in knowing that, because it's also the case, you know, in the Harry Potter series, Harry could stand up against Voldemort and understand him and speak his language because he was infected by him to some degree. Very.
Reese Wilson, we're going to ban you from the chat if I see one of those again. Okay? That is not funny. This is not the place for that.
A very interesting idea. Anyways, in the second, and the reason I'm telling you this, and this is worth thinking about, it's like, how long were each of those books? Like 500 pages? They're long, eh? And there was, how many of them? 7? And how many of them were sold? I mean, how many of you read every Harry Potter book? Right.
Nerds.
How many of you read at least one? Okay, how many of you saw the movies? It's like, you're all in a cult. You are, I'm telling you, really, that's the truth. It's really the truth. So, in the second volume, there's
that. All right, so here's what I'll say. You're all in a cult. No, really, that's the truth. I'm telling you, you are. If you don't like Jordan Peterson, I understand why. Because that, unless you are positively predisposed to him to begin with, of course that's ridiculous. You're in a cult. No, a cult is like Jim Jones go out and drink Kool-Aid. Right? Being a fan of Harry Potter is not the same as a cult. But like, again, it's like, you know, it's exactly, it's when your boss at work makes a joke, everyone laughs. And it's like, are they consciously choosing to like, well, because he's the boss, I'm going to laugh at his joke? Or is it just you're primed because you know he's the boss and he controls your pay, you know, and you're just always like, I want this person to like me because, you know, I've got, what do you call it? Money on the line. You're just going to prime yourself to respond positively. So, same thing with Peterson.
the snake that's zipping around there, the basilisk, right? And it lived.
Isn't this the regarded guy who almost killed himself from eating too much meat? No, he almost killed himself from being on benzos. The meat helped him. Carnivore diet, I wouldn't do it. Keto's fine. Low carbs is good. But hey, if you hate Jordan Peterson, I don't blame you.
Lives in the underground. That's chaos. That's chaos. And that's because wherever you are, you're on thin ice, and underneath your thin ice is chaos. And here we are in this unbelievably civilized environment, and everyone's getting along so perfectly. But you know, we've got lights, we've got electricity, the sewage system is working, no one's hungry. It's like, we can be peaceful.
So why give him all this grace? Because he has something to offer and maps of meaning, right? You got to flesh it out. Or are they laughing because other people are laughing? That's true too. You imitate others. That's why stand-up comedy is funnier when there's other people laughing. And someone's, laughing hard can make you laugh.
But if any of that fell apart, and it could easily fall apart because it's a bloody miracle it ever works at all, then the chaos that's just underneath the surface is going to come up right now. And it's useful to know that because it makes you properly grateful. If you really understand it, it makes you properly grateful for the bloody miracle that it is that you can be here in peace. So anyways, there's this snake that's underneath the surface, and it's, no joke, that thing. It's big, and it's ancient. It's always been there. And what happens if you look at it? It turns you to stone. right? It paralyzes you. Well, that's the Gorgon, that's Medusa, the woman with the head of snakes, and if you look at her, it paralyzes you. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're walking through the jungle and a big snake appears. What do? You freeze, and no bloody wonder, because you're a prey animal, and that's what they do when they see things that are going to eat them. And so the snake, well, lots of people still die from snake bite. And our ancestors were, and I mean our ancestors like, you know, tens of millions of years ago, when they were living in trees and weren't very big, they made a nice snack for a snake. And there's a woman named Lynn Isbell, who's an anthropologist at UCLA, who's correlated the presence of carnivorous snakes with the acuity of primate vision. And what she found was that the more snakes around, the better the primates could see. So, and we're particularly good at picking up patterns like snake camouflage in the lower half of our visual quadrant. You know, and people generally don't like snakes. You can learn to handle them, but no, snake fear appears to be innate. It's innate in chimpanzees, and it tends to increase as you age rather than decreasing. You can overcome it, but, well, my daughter had snakes, and one day her snake bit her. It was a fairly big snake, and she hadn't paid attention to it for a while, so it nailed her. And from then on, she had very difficult time grabbing the snake. It was like bitten once, you know, shy permanently. She also told me years later she had nightmares about snakes all the time when she had a snake in her room. It's like, you know, and I think it was probably the smell. So, anyways.
Okay, there's a couple interesting things right there. Snake. Higher visual acuity. Fuck, I just lost my train of thought. Archetype. It's easier to condition fear of snakes than it is guns, even though guns are more dangerous. Why? Because we evolved. The category of snake is pre-wired within us as infants. Duh. It's like, there's a great video of a beaver that was domesticated, never went outside, and it starts building a dam inside the human house. It's like, because yeah, that's an archetype. You're born with that instinct inside you. And the smell. Okay, well, we smell the snake. Smell, there's all kinds of unconscious shit that affects us. I believe this is a cool fact. They do this experiment where they give women 5 different jars filled with clothes full of sweaty clothes. So they have 5 or 10 different men work out and sweat, and then they take those clothes and put them in a jar. And then the women smell the sweat and rate the level of attractiveness or how like attracted they are to it. Women, better than chance, reliably rate the smell of men whose blood type would more likely lead to birthing complications. They rate those men's smell lower. So if you just ask which one smells better to you, this one. It's like, oh, it turns out that your body knows that person's blood type is more likely to cause birthing complications. Now, it'd be nice to have the study at hand as sight. But anyway, the smell of, so if you're in a room with snakes, it's informing your fucking unconscious. The smell of cat urine, I think, will freak out rats even though they've never been around a cat. Again, inbuilt archetypal stuff, right? The cat is an archetype for the rat in the same way that the snake is an archetype for the human. Or, you know, the adversary is an archetype of the human and all this stuff. But yes, they like the smell of facial symmetry. Yeah, there's there's elements of that too. And then also like birth control affects which faces they find attractive and all that. There's all kinds of subtle shit. Unless they have toxoplasmosis, yes, then the rats fucking go after the cat. It hijacks the archetype.
So, Harry Potter decides he's going to go after the basilisk, right? He's going to go out there and face the thing that he's most afraid of. So he does that, way down in the depths. So it's like Jonah going down into the depths. And he faces the basilisk, and it bites him. And you know, that's right, because if you go down into the depths, you can get bitten. Like, it's no joke. And this is a hero story, but the thing about the hero story is it's actually real. The thing that you're facing is actually dangerous. And even though facing it voluntarily might be your best bet, and is likely your best bet, because that's the central story of humanity, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. It's the real thing. So anyways, he gets bitten, right? And he's going to die. Now he's rescuing Ginny. So that's the St. George story. If you go after, like, dragons like to capture virgins. God only knows why. I think it's because...
we're going to skip this for political correctness reasons. Just kidding.
I think it's because one of the things that male humans have done from the beginning of time is chase the damn predators away. And I suspect that the males from God only knows how long ago, who were particularly good at that, were rewarded with female attention, and why the hell not? So it's deeply rooted inside of us, that idea of facing the unknown and freeing the woman. So the idea there is that if you, it's a male idea in large part. I can talk about the central female myth, and I will as we proceed. The idea is that if you're the sort of person who can stand up against the unknown and the frightening, then you're also likely, if you develop into that sort of person, then you're also likely to develop into the sort of person that other people will find attractive. So, you know, and that's why Jung believed that inside the shadow was the anima, which is like a female figure. And so his idea was something like, you know, if you watch movies, there's always this beta male guy, if they're romantic movies, and he's a nice guy, and he's the friend, and, you know, the woman tells him everything, but she doesn't like him a bit. She likes the guy who's, like, got an edge, and who's capable of, I would say, mayhem, but at least of aggression. Now, that doesn't mean she wants him to be aggressive, but what it does mean is that she wants him to be able to be aggressive. That would be good. And so he's the romantic target, and so he's the person that's incorporated the shadow, and he's someone that is respectable and perhaps useful. And so, well, that's a very old story.
Yeah, I won't go on a whole tangent about the, you know, the whole nice guy argument or idea or phenomenon when it comes to, like, dating and attractiveness. It's like, you need to be able to be kind and generous. You have to have that capacity. You have to have the capacity for, being dangerous. You know, it's like, there's the best way to describe, I think, the best way to describe the kind of partner that you want is someone who you can contend with, not fight with, and not, you know, manipulate. Someone who you can contend with, right? Someone who makes you better. That's what a good friendship is. Back and forth, you roast each other. If you cannot roast your fucking friends or your girlfriend or your partner, I don't know what you have. You do not have a real relationship, in my opinion. It's actually a good measurement of, like, who's your friend. Like, if someone's truly your friend, you can't really cross the line, like, by saying stuff. You can if it's like, if you know it's super insecure about something and you say that specifically. But, like, if you're just, like, talking shit, like, generically, like, oh, you're such a fucking tool or blah, blah, blah. Like, if you do that and someone gets offended by that, they're not that good of a friend compared to someone who you could do that with, and they just give it right back, right?
So let's think about this for a minute. I've already offered you a proposition, and I think it's an important proposition, and I'm offering you this proposition so that you can make sense of art and literature and mythology and religion and dance and all those strange ritualistic things that human beings do, which seem central to us, including, not least, the ineradicable tendency of us to seek out stories of heroes. I should finish the Harry Potter story. So Harry Potter goes down there to rescue Virginia. No, it's that's not her name. What is it?
Ginny.
Ginny, yeah. But there's a formal name for that.
Oh my God! It's like I'm in the lecture. Oh my God! He heard me. Oh my God!
It's a variant of Virginia, anyways, which is a variant of virgin. So.
Okay, that's a stretch. She could have been named anything, you know? Like, well, Ginny, she represents a virgin because her name's Ginny. It's like, yeah, okay, what if her name was, you know, Matilda or Helga, you know? It's like, I don't know to the degree to which she's like, oh, I am a virgin, you know? I don't know.
And he gets bitten. Yes, Ginevra, that's it. He gets bitten, and the bite is poison. And so there he is, dying, which doesn't seem to be so good. And then what happens? And again, you guys swallow this, it's no problem. So, what's his name, the Dumbledore character? He's got a bird, right? So he's the wise old man. He's the ruler of the castle. He's the ruler of the magic castle. He's the magic king. You know, he's like God the Father as far as Harry Potter is concerned. And he has a bird. What kind of bird is it? It's a phoenix, right? And one of the things that's very strange about a phoenix is that, well, it's immortal, but in a strange way. You know, it lives and lives, I think, 100 years, and it gets older and older, and then one day, poof, it bursts into flames and turns into an egg, and then you get a new phoenix. So that's a symbol of transformation. It's a symbol of transformation. The bird is a spirit or psyche. And so
the phoenix is the archetypal symbol of the progressive left-wing orientation. In order to transform something new, it must be burned down. It must be burned to the ashes and transform something into something new. And it's a positive representation of that. There's like communist revolution. That's bad, obviously. Burn it down and then we'll build something new, but that's garbage. But like archetypically, the idea that something must be burned down to bring something new, it's like, well, of course, yeah. That's progressivism at its best. You know, take the old thing and make it new. But don't just, you know, don't literally just light things on fire. It's symbolic.
Here's what it means, in part. You know how when you learn a lesson in your life that's not very pleasant? Right? It's not like when you learn something important, it's the best day of your life. It's often, the importance of what you learn is often proportionate to just how wretched it is to learn it. You know, you learn things the hard way. You learn things by getting hit, because obviously, if what you're doing is working, you get what you want. There's no learning in that, and that's happy. It's when you're doing something and you hit an obstacle, and maybe you bloody well hit it hard, and then, you know, you recoil, and then you down into the depths you go, and you have to sort yourself out, and you realize that you're, you know, this particular kind of idiot, and that you should probably fix that, and that's really annoying and difficult, and, you know, and maybe you're down in the dumps and anxious for quite a while, and then you get it repaired more or less, and, you know, you put yourself back together. That's the phoenix. Poof, into flames, bang, egg, new you. And so, you know, that's the ability to learn. Now, human beings are very strange creatures, right? Because we're very malleable compared to most animals. You know, like grizzly bears now and grizzly bears 1,000 years ago, it's like, whatever. They're the same thing. They do the same thing. There's no transformation. But human beings, we have this massive brain. And, you know, it's a pain because it means you have to take care of human children until they're 40. And, and that's a big burden. And so, you know, we pay a big price for it. It also makes childbirth very difficult. And it's costly. You have to eat a lot because you have a big brain, because it uses up a lot of energy. And so, you know, you pay a price for it. But the advantage is you're plastic. You can learn. Now, learning is a strange thing, because you can think of it as just acquiring more information. But you could also think of it, and this is more accurate, as finding out something that you're doing wrong, so that's sort of built into you, like a character element of your character, a presumption of your perception, or a deep habit. It's really built into you. It's a neural structure, right? It's alive. And you have to kill it because it isn't working properly. And the pain that you go through, in part, when you're suffering because you did something stupid, is it's something like the neurology. I can never get this quite right. It's the pain of the death of that structure. And that could be a huge chunk of you, you know, if you really have to go through a massive revision. It's like the person that comes out the other end might hardly be the same at all. You know, that happens, for example, if you're trying to combat alcoholism, which is just, you know, a wretched thing to do because, well, all your friends are alcoholic, all your family drinks too much. The only thing you know how to do when you're socializing is to go to the bar and drink too much. You know, and you spend like 20 hours a week on it. It's like, it's not just that you're addicted to the substance, it's like that's how you live. And so if you want to stop being an alcoholic, not only do you have to stop drinking alcohol, but you have to stop seeing all your drunk friends, and then maybe you've had them for your whole life, and you have to have continual battles with your drunk family, and then you have to figure out something to do with that 20 hours that's now like hanging around your neck like an albatross. And so you have to let that whole part of your personality die, and a new part has to spring forth. And that's what the phoenix is. And the phoenix is the capacity of the person to transform. And so when Harry gets bit by the snake that freezes him, he gets seriously injured. The phoenix comes in, cries some tears in his wound. It repairs him. Bang, he's back to life. And the strange thing is that that's okay with all of the viewers. Now, why would that be? There's nothing about it that's rational. Nothing, right? Magic castle, that's not rational. Giant snake underneath it, that's a little more rational. Turning you to stone, going down there to face it, being rejuvenated by a phoenix, it's like, yeah, that's okay, we'll watch that. we'll swallow it, we'll be completely engaged in it, and the reason for that is because it's a myth. It's about how people, it's a meta story about how to act, about how to conduct yourself in the world, to face.
Kyle V. PF's getting into why I see this stuff as merely descriptive, literary. He drops progressive. I think burn it down Trump, and someone hears Piker. That's fair. It's the same category, it's just the content of the category is different, but the category exists, right? It's like people have something called disgust sensitivity. Some people are more averse to, you know, blood and gore or sex stuff or whatever. That's high disgust sensitivity. And usually conservatives are higher in disgust sensitivity. Conservative personalities. But what triggers your disgust can be dependent on your political preferences. So, for example, conservatives are disgusted by, you know, immorality, you know, being gay or whatever, according to their religion. Okay? You can be a progressive that is just as disgusted by environmental sludge and toxins, and that's what drives the environmentalists. So you can have someone who has a conservative personality type who is a progressive politically. Right, which then gets into, well, then what do you mean conservative and progressive? Yeah, it's fine. That, you know, it's complicated. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. But yes, the category itself is real. It's what content fills it is interesting. But the category currently includes anyone want to describe. No, not necessarily. Like Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell are not burn it down Phoenix people, but Trump and the populists, Hassan Piker, whoever, are. There's a very clear distinction.
Face the things that you're afraid of that would otherwise paralyze you, to let the death of what is insufficient about you occur, and then to wait for the rebirth. Okay, so science is about what the world is, and myth and drama and dream and the unconscious, all of that. Let's say the aesthetic and artistic and fantastic side of humanity, that's more about how things should be. It's more about how to act. They're lessons in how to act, and they're abstract lessons. People are capable of abstraction, right? So you say, well, there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something bad about you and you and you, and so we'll take all the good things and make one good thing out of that, we'll take all the bad things and make one bad thing out of that, and then we sort of understand the difference between good and bad, and we get better and better and better and better at that over the centuries as we distill that, and then we have a figure of ultimate good and a figure of ultimate evil, and that helps us understand what those two things are. Those are the hostile brothers. That's a very common mythological motif, and you could say, well, they're at war inside you, and I think that that's a universal truth. It's an existential truth. The domain of ethics and morality is how are we in the world, and how should we be, what's the good. And the reason I'm telling you all this, apart from the fact that you should know it, because this is what you should know if you go through university, is that it bears directly on issues of health. You're trying to accomplish something, say if you go see a psychotherapist, you know, you could say, well, I'm trying to get healthy. But you know, that's not really right. What you're trying to do when you go see a therapist is get your life together. And that's not the same thing, you know, like mostly when I'm acting as a therapist, it's not like I'm directly treating mental disorder. Like mental disorders aren't, they're just not neat little boxes. It's not like someone has a fully functioning life, but they have an anxiety disorder. And then you bring them and you treat the anxiety disorder and they go back to their fully functioning life. It's like, it's not like that at all. The disorder is tangled out into their life. You know, if you're depressed, well, usually your workplace isn't going very well and your relationships with the people around you are damaged, and you know, you're connected in the actual world with all of these things. And so when you come to see a therapist, you have to work on putting your life together in a sustainable manner, and that's certainly not just removing the mental illness. It's very rare. Now and then you see someone who's depressed, whose life is together, and they're just depressed. Something's gone wrong, probably biochemically. And so with someone like that, you can often give them SSRIs. I can't give them to them, but I can recommend them. Recommend they go see a doctor anyways. And that sometimes just does the trick, because you know, their life is actually pretty good. They just can't see it, but that's bloody rare, man. It's usually the case that someone comes and sees you and things are in a serious state of chaos, and all of that has to be addressed, and some of it's psychological and a lot of it's just practical. It's embedded out there in the world. That's what the behavioral psychologists are particularly concerned about. So anyways, psychology, especially the clinical end, is predicated on it's necessarily predicated on the question, how is it that we obtain the good? How do we aim at the good, and what would that be? When my clients first come to see me, one of the things I often ask them is, okay, well, let's say you look a year ahead. What do you want? What are we aiming at? What would your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be, or at least partly that way? Then we aim at that, right? And we look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing, and we develop strategies, and we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. All right, to understand the categories of myth, we'll say, we have to understand something about the nature of categorization. Now, categorization is a tricky thing, and we're going to run through some complicated ideas relatively quickly. You know, you think you put things in the same category because they're similar, but the problem is that, first of all, that's not an answer. It's just a restatement of the initial proposition. And second of all, you can put things in the same category that are by no means identical, and you often do that. And third, things that are similar are often also importantly different. And so picking which element of similarity, you know, like let's say you have a group of books. Well, are they the same? Well, obviously no, because unless they're, you know, all the same book. But the category of books is a pretty strange category because the content of the books differs completely. Well, you could still make a group of books, and you pick some arbitrary element that unites them and consider that grounds to make a category. There's other categories, more scientific categories, and scientific categories tend to actually contain things that are very, very similar across multiple dimensions. Like protons are like that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that distinguishes one proton from another, and the same with electrons. And you know, the set of triangles is like that because you can define it precisely. But most of the categories that human beings use aren't so neat, and the problem with that is that unless the categories are neat, like scientific categories, it's very difficult to investigate them scientifically. So for example, you might do research on a group of people with anxiety disorders, but the problem with that is that the anxiety disorder category is so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to identify the commonalities across all the people who are in that category, and that's partly because the category isn't actually a scientific category. It's a hybrid category. It's a practical category. I can give you an example of that.
Boomer moment.
No, I can't because I must not have saved it. Anyways, many of the DSM categories, so these are categories for psychopathology, require, if you're part of that category, imagine there's 7 symptoms that you could have, or 8 symptoms that you could have that would put you in that category, like antisocial personality. 8 symptoms. You steal, you kick, you hit, you bite, you know, you're abusive. I don't remember the categories precisely, but you can be in the category if you have symptoms 2 through 5, and you can be in the category if you have symptoms 6 through 8. They aren't the same symptoms, but you're in the same category. And you think, well, how the hell can that be? Well, that's a family resemblance category, roughly speaking, and lots of the things that we use are family resemblance categories. There's a prototype, and then if you have enough of the features of that prototype, imagine the prototype has 10 features, and if you have 6 of those features, you get to be in that category. But it means that the category is actually quite diverse, and that's one of the problems that plagues psychiatry as a science and clinical psychology as a science. It's a really big problem because if the categories aren't homogeneous, then it's very difficult to draw conclusions about the members of the category. And the psychologists and the psychiatrists claim that those are scientific categories, but they're not, and they can't be, partly because they're aimed at the classification of health or ideal versus non-health or non-ideal, and partly because they play multiple roles, eh? I mean, the category isn't there just to provide neat demarcations for scientific study. The category is there to give people a language to talk about certain sets of symptoms, to diagnose, because you know, when you come in and you have a set of symptoms, you might want to know what they are so that you also know what they aren't. It's really a relief often to find a diagnosis. And then of course the diagnosis has certain implications for treatment and for billing and for all of that, so the category has to play all of those roles. So there's multiple types of category. And the category...
Family resemblance, by the way, Wittgenstein. Okay, if you're gonna do any, you know, intro overview of a philosopher, Wittgenstein and language games. Incredibly potent. Family resemblance, right? What is a game? Poker, soccer, StarCraft. What the hell do those 3 have to do with each other? Family resemblance. There's something about them, right? There's an underlying thing about them.
Categories that we're talking about in relationship to mythology aren't scientific categories. They're categories about the world construed as a place to act. So here's a way to think about it.
We're almost done, by the way, because there's a break halfway through.
You're always looking at the world through a framework of reference. And you have to do that because there isn't very much of you.
Oh. All right, everyone. Let me just take a moment here. That diagram. Okay, I'm going to pull it up again. This diagram, this is the most important diagram. It defines reality. We'll let him explain it, but pay attention to this diagram.
You can't see the whole world at once. And in fact, the amount of the world you actually see is so small you can't believe it. The central part of your vision is zipping around, producing a pretty high resolution representation of exactly what you're looking at. But outside of that center, like if I...
He goes much, in later lectures, he goes into much more detail in that. But that lecture, that defines, he calls it a unit of perception, right? To live as a human being, to perceive reality, you're operating within that diagram. That diagram defines every moment of your waking existence. But I guess I'll get to it later.
I look at you, I can't see her eyes. I can see her glasses, but barely. I can't even tell whether you're male or female. The person past that, I can't see at all. Now you don't notice that, you know. You don't notice that you're that blind because your central vision is always popping around, illuminating that tiny space. But you're so damn blind, it's just mind-boggling. And I'm sure some of you have seen the Invisible Gorilla video, you know, where a gorilla comes into the video and you don't notice, which is somewhat shocking because you would think that you would notice a gorilla. But what happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. And because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception. Bloody well think about that for a minute. That's a Buddhist idea, right? People live in a kind of illusion, and sometimes that illusion causes suffering, and they can transform the way they look at the world, and that can release them from their suffering. But the idea that you do live in an illusion, well, I don't know if it's exactly an illusion, but you certainly do live within a framework of perception that's determined by your values. Now that is so weird, you know, because we never think of the world as something that reveals itself through our values. But of course it does, because you look at what you want. You aim at what you want, and once you've aimed, the world lays itself out for you, and that's exactly how perception works. That's why I represented it this way. You're always somewhere, that's point A, and that's somewhere in some place in some time, and you always have some notion about what you want to have happen next. You know, you're going to go to the next class, maybe you've got a plan after this. In this class you have a plan, you're hoping to learn something, I presume, and maybe you have a goal with regards to a grade, and that's nested inside your desire to get a degree, and that's nested inside your desire to be educated and to have a career and have a successful life. So attending to me at the moment, the reason you're doing that is because all of those values exist within you simultaneously, focusing your attention. And so you're attending to me and not to something else, assuming that all of you with your computers open aren't surfing the web, which you might be, but assuming that you're focusing, whatever you're focusing on is directed by what you value. And some of that can be unconscious. In fact, a lot of it is unconscious, because you know it's very difficult for you to get control of what you pay attention to. You know what that's like. You're trying to study, it's kind of a boring paper. Christ, your attention is just like everywhere, you know. Maybe you'll vacuum under the bed instead of doing the reading the paper, you know. You can't get a grip on that thing, so your attention has an autonomy. And that's another psychoanalytic idea, you know, because you kind of think, well, you're in control. It's like, really? You ever try telling yourself what to do? How does that work for you? I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. Right, sure you are. Yeah, I'm going to quit eating sugar for a month. It's like, how long does that last? It's like 15 minutes, and you're eating like 3 chocolate bars. So this is Freud's central insight, I would say. You're an autonomous group of spiritual agents, let's say, personalities, and they don't really get along very well. And you, the ego, we'll say, is by no means necessarily in charge. And that's a very strange thing to realize, but you can really realize that by noticing how little control you have over your attentional focus. Okay, so you've got your point A, you're going to point B, you're always doing that, you inhabit a structure of value, and it changes what the point A is and what the point B is, but the structure itself doesn't change. And when you're looking at the world, what you see is not objects, you see tools, and they make you happy. Those are things that facilitate your movement forward. And you see obstacles, and those are things that make you unhappy. And when you encounter an obstacle, one of the problems is, well, you don't get to where you're going, and that's a problem. But the other problem is, if you encounter an obstacle, the frame might be wrong, right? Because you never know. It might be just something that you could detour around real easily. Might be a fatal flaw in your whole plan. And so obstacles have this dual nature. They get in your way, but they can also take your plan down. And so they can produce anxiety. So my point is, and there's a book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. It's a great book by Gibson, J.J. Gibson, if I remember correctly. Gibson. And this is, although I thought of this a while back, I realized eventually that it was a variant of his theory, and what he believed was that when people looked at the world, they saw value first and inferred objects second. So for example, for Gibson, if you're standing by a cliff, you don't see a cliff and then think about the fact that you might fall and then feel frightened. You see a falling off place. And part of the seeing of that, part of the act of seeing is being afraid of that. Because your eyes are connected right to your emotional systems. And part of what your eyes do is tell you what the object is. But your eyes do all sorts of other things. Like they prepare you for action. They prepare you for gripping. They prepare you for emotion. And none of that actually requires the existence, necessarily the existence of your perception of the object. So there are people who have blind sight. And if you show them, so they think they can't see, but if you flash them an angry face, they'll show a skin conductance response. And that's because the visual pathways to the amygdala, which does facial emotional processing, can still be active. These are people who've usually had a stroke, so their eyes are okay, but they've destroyed the visual cortex. So anyways, it's perfectly plausible that at least at one level of analysis, when you look at something, you see its utility first. So you see a chair, and you might say a chair is an object, but I wouldn't say that. A beanbag's a chair, and a stump is a chair. And they don't share much in common, except that you can sit on them. And so, you know. Okay,
this is a nuanced point. The best example I can think of is, imagine you have two people sitting in a room, okay, and the door opens, and Bob walks in, okay? If for person A, Bob is someone who abused them when they were a child, and for person B, Bob is a total and complete stranger. When Bob walks into the room, when person A sees Bob's face, there's no thinking, there's no cognition. The sight of Bob evokes an emotional response as quick as you would see a snake in the ground. That just or like you put your hand on the stove and burns it, and you take it off. The valence, the emotional valence, the value and the meaning of the object you're looking at is encoded in the object of itself. And that's what he talks about with your eyes being mapped directly to your amygdala, or your eyes being mapped directly to, is it your hypothalamus as well? I don't know. But, you know, it's like the American flag. Like, when, you know, if you're patriotic and, you know, and maybe your dad died fighting in Iraq or something, and you got a flag that sits above your mantle. It's okay, you view that flag as a positive, good thing. But then if you are a Iraqi jihadist or whatever, you see that flag and it's evil. And so if you blindfolded the jihadist and the guy whose dad fought, in the army, and the flag sat on his mantle, and you blindfold them and you put a flag in front of them and you take the blindfolds off at the exact same time, that flag transmits emotion before any cognitive processes take place. Right? Hence, you don't see the object and then think about it and then have an emotional reaction. You see the object and it immediately creates the emotional reaction, which then colors your thinking, right? And then you have motivated reasoning. Vibes have primacy.
The chair is basically conceptualized by its functional utility, and when you look at a chair, what you perceive is its functional utility, and the chair tells you what to do. It says, sit on me, and there are people who have prefrontal damage, and they engage in something called utilization behavior.
Sit on me.
If they're walking down a hallway and there's a door open, they have to walk through it. They can't not do what the object tells them to do. That's called utilization behavior.
Utilization behavior. Okay. I've heard him say this before, but we're going to look this up in a second here. Because that sounds like a hilarious, it's a terrible predicament to be in, but utilization behavior. Someone sees an open door and has to walk through it. Sounds like a bunch of nonsense. But we'll look it up in a second.
So that's how the world is laid out. And I would say inside that domain, you're in the predictable world. You're in the world that you understand, that you know, and that if you hit an obstacle, or if you're outside that domain, you're in the unknown. You're in unknown territory. In the mythological world, in the world for action, you could conceptualize the world as a stage for action. And this is a Shakespearean quote that sort of sums it up quite nicely. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And you might say, well, is that really true? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by true. And that really is the answer, because there are different ways of defining true. So, and it isn't self-evident that there's only one way of defining true that's appropriate. You know, the definition of truth might be more like a tool. And, you know, we are tool-using creatures, and really what we're trying to do with our conceptions of truth is to work through the world successfully.
Pragmatism. Central to Petersonian philosophy.
So even science is subordinate, should be subordinate, to our use of the world as a tool. Because if it isn't a useful tool, like, what are we doing with it? You know, just generating technology that might destroy the world. That seems like a bad idea. So I think that the world as tool is actually the fundamental sort of truth, and I think that that's a Darwinian idea, right? That our notions about the world have evolved through a Darwinian process, and that it's appropriate for us to regard as what is most real those things that reliably ensure the continuation of our life and the probability of our propagation. And if you're a true Darwinian, I don't think there's a way out of that argument. And it isn't self-evident by any stretch of the imagination that seeing the world as objects is the way that our brain works. In fact, I don't think it's the way it works at all. And I think that that's why we're so wired for stories, right? It's a mystery. You know, like, you won't line up for 2 hours to go see a lecture, but you'll line up for 2 hours, maybe you'll even camp overnight if your mythological imagination has been seized for God only knows what reason by Star Wars. And, you know, that's a source of mythology. It's the mythology of the modern person, and it fills a gap, and that's why...
Star Wars, the mythology of the modern person. You know how many resources were spent to build the Colosseums? The temples of all the 7 wonders of the world, the pyramids of Giza? How much money was spent developing the latest movie, like Marvel movie? Is it like tens of billions of... No, I mean, not tens of billions. Is it? It's hundreds of millions of dollars? Some of them, or video games. Don't video games cost like $1 billion to develop or something? Those are our mythological and religious monuments. Star Wars is the religion of the modern man. Religion in form, fit, and function. Crazy.
Why people do it. So that, to me, speaks of the manner in which our psyches are constructed. And that's a Jungian idea. That's the idea of the archetype, essentially. That to be human is to participate in a certain pattern of being.
Peterson's squishy version of truth puts him entirely in the postmodernist frame. To some degree, yes. Which, you know, he criticizes postmodernism a lot. For those who don't know, he does, for sure. But he does say often, give the devil his due. And he just needs to give the devil more due than he does. But he is certainly... Postmodernism and pragmatism are certainly linked. Our cultural artifacts are pathetic by a percentage of GDP, though. Fair. It depends. I mean, if you build a $6 billion sports stadium in your city, that's a pretty significant chunk of the economic activity in that local city. You know, it depends on how you measure it.
And that pattern of being is acted out socially, it's acted out individually, but it's also part of your structure, even your perceptual structure as a living organism of your particular type. And it would be the case, at least in part, that the hero myth, which is go out where no one has gone before, face the terrors of the unknown, gather something of value, and return, is the central story of humankind. It's not the only central story, but it's up there in the top 3. And many of the dramas that you engage yourself in are variations of that story. And you watch it over and over and over because You're trying to learn how to do that, because that's what you need to do to live.
Break? I think we'll take a break.
Here's an idea.
I think we'll come back to this on Wednesday, because I don't know where the break is. I don't even know if he actually has one. Oh, does he change shirts? Should we keep going? Man, we're already an hour 18. We'll come back to that on Wednesday. Doodle-doo-doo. All right, let's do some Q&A here for 5 minutes or something. Yeah, interesting. Let's what are some of the key takeaways here? Reviewing the notes. By the way, the notes should be linked in the description if you'd like to see them. Yeah, the point about neural circuitry, we reappropriate our neural circuitry to see, objects or to see threats in the social world. Again, it's a nuanced idea. It's like, here's an example. Your value system determines what you see. If you ever, for people who play League of Legends or people who play a video game, if, I don't know what happened here. If you watch a really complicated League of Legends play and you've never played the game, it literally just looks like complete fucking mush. Like, it just looks like pixels. Flame things are being shot out everywhere. Like, you don't know what the fuck is going on. But if you play League of Legends, what you see is literally different. Like, your attention automatically goes to certain parts of the scene, right? Oh, also, we got to look up... hold on. We got to look up utilization behavior here. Utilization behavior. Utilization behavior. Ooh, that looks interesting. Oh my God, there's when I look it up. It's Jordan Peterson. Did he make it up? I don't believe it's real. I want to see a video of someone doing it.
Let's talk about another symptom that can happen in dementia, but rarely gets talked about. When someone with dementia has this symptom, it can make it incredibly dangerous for everyday common household objects to be around. It can also lead to some pretty embarrassing situations in public. Let's see if this is a symptom your loved one with dementia might have. It's called utilization behavior. Have you ever heard of this before? Other names it might be called include magnetic apraxia, imitation behavior, or compulsive utilization behavior. Utilization behavior is a compulsive and automatic use of objects that are within reach, regardless of the situation or context. Basically, a person loses their ability to inhibit a behavior when an object is presented. Right now, for most of us watching this,
well, hold on, sorry. Is this loud? It's showing loud on my thing.
Inhibit our behaviors on a daily, ongoing basis. We're able to control what we do and what comes out of our mouth. So that, let's say, for example, a super good-looking person passes in front of you, you are not going to just put your arms around them and hug them. You would let them walk past. Or if you're at a restaurant and a waiter walks by with a delicious-looking plate of food and they're headed to a table, you're not going to put your hand on that plate and eat it because you realize that's not an appropriate behavior for the situation. Even if that food smelled and looked delicious and you would like a taste of it, you don't do it.
Wow. That's wild. That's what Peterson was talking about, going through a door. Crazy. All right, we'll get to some questions here, or we'll do the comments here. Basically like a drunk person or toddler, yeah. I'm glad you're doing this series. The 2017 lectures were a formative experience for me, and it's nice to rewatch them years later. Excellent. Hopefully it's useful. I'm trying to not interject too much so, the professor can speak. But yeah, we'll learn and adapt as we go. I don't take as many notes. I really, and maybe I should do that more. I'm taking notes mainly for my benefit, the things that stick out to me, because a lot of the stuff, you know, I know that I'm not going to take a note on something that he repeats very, very often. I sometimes might, but hopefully it's useful. But yeah, if people have feedback, if people watched till the end and leave comments, let me know how to improve this. I think this setup is fine, right? Lecture up here, notes here. Yeah. But we'll keep doing this, and we'll get in a routine. I think Mondays and Wednesdays, lectures. Monday, Wednesday, 5:00. Okay. Get your dinner meal ready. Go play some video games while you're watching this. Great stuff. Let's take the guns away from Grandpa Syndrome. Yes. Why the 2017 lectures, not the less contaminated by politics 2015 lectures? The 2017 ones, I don't recall being that contaminated by politics. And the 2017 ones are much higher production value. That was kind of them. Because I've seen the 2017, I've gone through the 2017 ones once before. So for my benefit, it would have been better to go through maybe the 2014, 2015 ones. But the production value is just so much better on the 2017 ones because it's following him. The 2014 ones look kind of grainy. It's just more aesthetically accessible. His Daily Wire season is probably my least favorite, yeah. I remember thinking when I was first watching these series that I wish I had an outlet to talk about these ideas with other people. Well, Purple Monkey Dishwasher, welcome to the fucking Thunderdome. Learning from Jordan back then got me into Nietzsche and Jung. Great. Paul, I've been finishing final projects and haven't been properly orbiting. Have you moved yet? Jay Huber, everyone. I have moved, Mr. Huber, and I will communicate the information to you via another medium momentarily. 2015 ones were more joke-laden. Well, fuck. We're getting shafted. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, please like the stream. I appreciate it, especially if you watch all the way through. That would be beneficial. And then I'll get the next one scheduled for Wednesday evening, and we'll absolutely fucking roll. Hear, hear. Do you generally agree with Peterson's interpretation of Nietzsche? I don't know enough Nietzsche to tell you which interpretation is correct or not. I am fairly confident that the things he says factually that Nietzsche predicted or whatnot are true. But yeah. Oops, where'd it go? Pretty sure that's a collection of anecdotes, not lecture notes. I'm still unsure what I was just taught, and I don't imagine the collected notes of the viewers would converge. Listen, Kyle V. You know, in Judaism, there's this old story about 3 children, and one of them asks how they can help or something, and one of them asks what the meaning of this is, and the third child asks, why are we even doing this, blah, 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 blah. And you're the important third Jewish child, Kyle. That's fair. Well, this is really just for people, if you're interested in watching old school Jordan Peterson. That's all this is for. Whether or not he's spouting misinformation, I suppose you run that risk when you listen to any lecturer, right? You suffer the biases of whoever you ingest your information from. And Peterson's are far more obvious, so it's easier to criticize. But if I were to just go find some bum-ass random lecturer, actually, you'd be less likely to know if you'd be getting nonsense because you're less equipped to identify their biases. Whereas Peterson, it's quite clear he loses his mind. All right. Godspeed, everyone. Appreciate it. And we'll be back Wednesday. Peace on earth.